All right, Thirze, the floor is all yours.
Right, thank you so much, Marlene. Yeah, as Marlene already mentioned, I am currently at Wageningen University, although this work, what I'm going to present is based on a publication on a project together with the Red Cross, and that was when I was still based in the University of Leeds during a postdoc there. A little bit about my background, so you know who you have in front of you. I coming from physical geography and coming from natural science turned into social sciences. And that's exactly what I now use to look into processes of knowledge and how innovation and transformation happens. And concretely, my background is a little bit more on the agricultural side, so not so much into early warning systems or disaster risk itself, but I worked a lot on floods and droughts, and that's how I got into working with the Red Cross on these projects. At the same time, what we discussed today is quite based on a literature review, and it sometimes turns quite abstract. And perhaps there's some people in the audience who have more of a philosophy background, so I also would love to hear everybody's input on this. So it's more of a discussion for me than just me talking. So let's see, does that change? Yeah, great. So what I'm talking about today is actually based on a publication, and obviously that was not just me. This was a collaboration between different authors, as you can see, Robert, Mark, Hannah, Rebecca, and Anushka. And we're all different nationalities, even different continents, and also different backgrounds. So this was quite, the process itself of going through this literature review was quite interesting, with the different angles that we have also coming from natural sciences or social sciences background. So just to make sure that you know. And a little bit about this author group, because when we started this journey, it started out as literature review, and then we thought, okay, but who are we in this process itself? And I just told you something about my background. But in general, representing the authors group, we had some authors that were descendants of what would be perceived of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge holders, but not ourselves, to be very clear. And so in our discussions, we put it up immediately at the start that we also mostly received a scientific knowledge education. So we really want to delve into these concepts of what is the knowledge and what does integration mean. And we are not going into anything that is about the process of how to collect, what local knowledge is, or how that works. The focus is very much on integration and what that means. So just to put that up front. To get actually back to the start, how we got into this and into doing this is that we noticed that I see this with my agricultural background as well, but also in disaster risk reduction. For example, the Sendai framework, there is increased call for this. We need to use, this is literally coming out of the Sendai framework, this is not my own language, the use of traditional indigenous local knowledge and practices as appropriate to complement scientific knowledge in disaster risk assessment, and the development and implementation of policy strategies, plans, and programs. So we could see a call also in the sustainable development goals in general, the global framework for climate services, and even within the Red Cross itself, we could see the increase of this call to integrate or use or combine both different words. And then when we looked at the literature itself, this was sort of at the start, we saw that combining knowledges is not something new. It started in the 70s, but it became more popular after certain events, the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, and also the Cyclone Zoe in 2002. And so for our review, we also started from that moment, not before that. And we can see over the years, probably due to these calls in these global policies, this has gone up quite a lot, as you can see in the graph here. So that's a little bit our starting point, with this idea that the call for integrating and combining these knowledges is becoming bigger, but we don't have that much yet on what does that mean and what are the implications of doing that, and do we have an idea of how we do that? So this is very much on the context of our literature review. We chose specifically to look at early warning systems, partly to represent, because disaster risk reduction, we noticed is quite a big field and it has some overlap with climate adaptation, climate services, but we really tried in this specific review to focus on early warning systems. Of course, the discussion that at the end, the questions that come up, the considerations are relevant for these other fields as well. And again, from my author background, I recognize a lot of the same questions also in other fields. So I think that what made it quite interesting. So probably a lot of you know already what an early warning system is, but I'll give a little bit of a lens that we used here. So in general, the early warning system, and it's the only abbreviation I will use in my slides, EWS, so you'll see that come back. Going from risk knowledge to monitoring and forecasting to dissemination and communication, and then preparedness and response. And we can already see this is quite a linear framing. So we're going from one to another step. So what we did in our literature review, we have 4 points that we reviewed every article that we found with, and I'll come back to the methodology a little bit later. Firstly, we looked at what approach did people use to integration. So again, we specifically focused on integration. So where there was very explicit that both knowledges were combined. So not only local knowledge, that literature was not included in here. Then secondly, we wanted to see where in this early warning system does this integration mostly happen? Thirdly, outcomes. So what were the outcomes in these literature reviews of integration? And lastly, what were the reported challenges or enablers of this integration process? Of course, these are quite concrete goals of what do you look at in the papers that we reviewed, but we were very interested in sort of these underexplored questions that we could get out of this literature, which might not be explicitly in the articles, but what we read through in between the lines. So answering those 4 points, what can we say then about what represents equitable knowledge integration, and how is knowledge legitimized, and where and who controls that process? So actually looking a little bit into the assumptions, and to do that, that's where we then use those 4 questions at the start. So for this presentation as well, I'll show you a little bit of what we found according to these 4 points in all the papers, and then the last bit is trying to go a little bit deeper, perhaps a little bit abstract, but I think it's really interesting because I don't know for you, but I normally work a lot in the field and I barely had or get time to think about some of these underlying assumptions and what that means then for how we practice or how we do and set up our research methods. So that's a bit of context. Before I start going into the exact papers and what came out of the papers, there are already some quite big concepts in here. For example, what is knowledge? What is integration? So before I go into the papers and what we found, just a little bit, a short discussion and points that came up already that might make you think. This is by no means very extensive. There is more literature out there, and we refer to that in the paper as well, where this is discussed also. But it's quite important, I think, to put that up front, because first, if you're gonna look at integrating two knowledges, how do we describe what is local knowledge and what is scientific knowledge? So sort of this, I don't know how to say it, intuitive. When I ask people what they think that knowledge is, you get a bit of an intuitive reaction. So scientific, I think people find easier to define. People often suggest it's approach as a formal methodology or formal education. We have agreed methods to say something is, that makes it scientific. And then for local, people find it a lot harder to describe what local knowledge is. So you get something of the intrinsic ways of making predictions by people who live in close ties with certain natural environments, but it can also be associated with local culture and long-term settlements. And something that I came out of the discussion throughout this process was by some way, it almost seems that what defines local knowledge is that it's distinct from scientific knowledge. Everything that we don't say is scientific knowledge, we make that local knowledge. And this is sort of what reactions you get when you ask people, so what's expected? Because of course, there are quite some issues with these definitions. For example, thinking about local knowledge also has rigorous process and are also agreed upon within communities and are also evidence-based. So is rigorousness or evidence really the right words to define scientific knowledge? Both knowledges are dynamic and not, not homogeneous. They are heterogeneous. I see I made a typo there. So they are different. They might be different for their conflicts. Also in scientific knowledge, we have conflicts. And then lastly, the methods used sometimes overlap. And there's also a history to it and a politics to it, why certain knowledges and methods are used. So as you can see, this makes some of these definitions to really differ between these knowledges quite difficult. And I think that's, for example, why positionality also become quite important, because, and I'm going to come back to this in the end, that even as a researcher, you might also have local knowledge. And is that really distinct for yourself? What the part is of you that has scientific knowledge and what the part is that has local knowledge? And I'm going to come back to that. So this is just already to get you thinking a little bit where we're going here. Of course, for the sake of reviewing the literature, we went with the term local knowledge. And in the literature, sometimes other terms were also used, but we used this umbrella term of local knowledge because we needed a way to go through the literature and select what was done. Then there's one other term, and that's the term integration. Integration might, for some people, I guess most people think very logically integration, it means something, but if you think about it a little bit more critically, there are different ways of integrating something. And you can see I made some little circles to give a little bit of an illustration about the different ways of integrating something. So the combination of specialized knowledge to reach results. This can be, as you see on the left side, by connecting everybody from their own space, or it might be really overlapping or putting one knowledge within another one. Another description that I've seen for integration is process of putting individual knowledge into collective knowledge, which is again a different way of thinking about what integration is. For this review, we used the wording that we found in the papers, but later on in the discussion we'll come back that this has quite some implications about what integration is. So we went with looking at this collective process of combining, and I'm underlining combining as integration because I'll come back on that later, where we have specialized but different knowledges, because to integrate something, you're already assuming that you have two different things. And this is also something I'll come back to. And why integration in early warning systems? The arguments that we found that were mostly used are to make early warning systems appropriate for local context, to improve the response to scientific content in early warning systems, to mobilize communities, or banking on knowledge strengths. So these are sort of the concrete arguments that are used in why integration is important, and what we see back in this global policies as well. So what we did after some more abstract term discussion to get you started, we did a realist systematic literature review. So we used both peer-reviewed articles and grey literature. And the grey literature, we use certain websites because we realized that a lot of the NGOs also work on this, but that work is often not in peer-reviewed articles. So we did a Google search. We use some specific websites. If you want more information on the exact method, you can find that as well in the paper, but I didn't want to spend too long going through that here. This is shortly what we did use as our keywords, and then to select, include or exclude. And the number of records we screened were 2,583. I think the main thing is that we used integration. That's how we can skip some. But eventually we included 116 studies. So next I'll show you a little bit what we got out of this literature. So I'll show you some numbers, and that's based on these 116 papers that we screened. Start a little bit with the meta-analysis on the literature. What we found, I see the quality is a bit bad, but the percentages are per continent is sort of where most of the literature was, I wouldn't say it was from, but the studies were there. We did not do a specific analysis on where the authors were from. Most were based at Western institutes, but obviously we couldn't check their nationalities. That would be a lot more work to do. But to see, we mainly in Africa and Asia, there were most studies. And I think this already says something about where local knowledge as a term is used. Whereas we actually can find local knowledge in every environment. So that says something about that word and the way that word is used, which will come back in the discussion as well. Let's see, we did a hazard distribution. So we see a lot of climatological and also multi-hazards. See? Right, so as I mentioned in the review, we also did this sort of quantitative analysis of how many papers did what. This was according to the 4 points that I used at the start. So starting off with what are the existing practices for integration? I'm not sure if it was quite surprising to me, but maybe for others not, that there was most articles do not have a very specific explanation of how they integrated it, which means that for this question of how do articles approach integration, it also becomes a little bit more of a goal of what they used it for. We see most articles that talked about integrating knowledges use participatory approach. We did make a difference here because there was really quite a big group that specifically used GIS or mapping methodologies. So to get input from local communities on these methods, and others just used mainly focus group discussions or other types of community engagement. We had then another group of papers that really looked at local knowledge as a starting point. So instead of thinking how to use it for what I'm doing, like mapping or GIS, their focus was more on how is information used by people, which is a little bit of a different starting point, and I'll come back to that later. Then there were some papers who used integration in terms of trying to tailor their technology to a local level. So how do we make this model more applicable to this specific region by using local knowledge? What was also fairly popular, and I think maybe that's what comes up to mind to a lot of people, is knowledge comparison and verification. And in most cases, this means, can we verify local knowledge indicators by the use of scientific methodologies? Then forecast technology, which is quite strongly connected to verification or also to downscaling. And then there were also some other things that were quite surprising to me, which are education. So how do we in education integrate both knowledges better? Also infrastructure design. So there were some projects that really looked at sort of house building in the early warning systems, or improving mainly houses, I think maybe some roadworks or other systems. And then lastly, also looking at an institutional design. So to really focus on the communication between, and what role is that? So the second question is, where in the early warning system? And I guess some of these approaches are very connected to a specific phase. Mainly is risk knowledge. So thinking about hazard mapping, that was very popular, or the most participatory methods actually fell into this risk knowledge category. Then monitoring and forecasting, and the least papers were sort of discussing dissemination and communication. And I think it might be because dissemination and communication is also very often unidirectional. So from one way, like we have a warning and it trickles down. And we have a bit less information that is paid to the process of information triangulation. So, and that's also mainly what takes place in that phase. see. Right, so this is the outcomes. So what I mean with outcomes here is how did the literature report outcomes? And to no surprise, most papers said it was a very positive thing to integrate. For their work improved better action and communication, it reduces risk. We managed to locally adapt the early warning system. It increases trust and understanding, but also increasing the awareness and hazard or capacity building. And some very concrete examples was, for example, in this paper, Nashton et al., that there was a downscaling of weather and climate forecasts, which improved the decision making and early action. So that's the type of reporting you get. Luckily, or I thought luckily, because I thought it would be quite interesting, we also had 12 papers that reported a little bit more neutral outcomes, like there are risks or negatives with this integrating of knowledges. One paper found there's an issue of gender discrimination in this process, so who gets to be involved in this knowledge production. And there was little work on really integrating that information in the analysis. So I think they did the type of exercise where the local knowledge was collected, but in the analysis, it sort of was left behind. A concrete example of two papers were that they were quite honest that the improvements were only short term. There was not really transformative change by integrating this. And another paper reported that this GIS training, so they did an exercise where it was GIS mapping, and they used the inputs of the locals to improve that mapping, but there was no GIS training for the locals. So in that way, it was quite extractive. But again, papers that are dishonest are a minority, as you can see. And then the last two bits on these numbers of the papers is for the challenge and enablers, where it gets quite interesting. Firstly, the challenges, sorry. There were most papers reported varying perceptions, understandings of risk and early warning systems. And I think this is quite an interesting one. Maybe not surprising, but it's quite connected to other papers that use the word in communication. It shows something about the perspective this work was done. Because on this first point, it's most cases, I dare to say, the varying perceptions and especially the issue of understanding lies with the local community not understanding the scientific content that is shared in early warning systems. So that says something about the perspective you're already taking when talking about integration. And just to be very clear, the wordings used in these tables is from the papers themselves. So this is not something that we came up with. We really tried from the bottom up to see what wording was used. The second bit, the challenge is you get this dominance of scientific knowledge. So in that process of integration, what they end up with, so what the action is based on, ends up being on the scientific knowledge. Third biggest challenge were the power relations between different stakeholders, which leads to trust issues. Trust is a very, very big issue that was reported in a lot of them in different ways. Communication, as I already mentioned. So there was poor communication, or it was very difficult to communicate between stakeholders. Then uncertainty. And uncertainty also comes into that maybe as research scientists, you have a certain understanding of what uncertainty is, or what that means, or how then to interpret the outputs. So also this uncertainty is connected to the understanding, but we did put it separately. Then on the other side, so where the challenge means it lies in models coming from scientific knowledge, another challenge was there's very little documentation or intergenerational transmission of local knowledge. So this was reported as a challenge, I think, because in this sense, researchers thought it was quite difficult to get hold of it. And then environmental changes. And I think this quite representative is that it's quite difficult sometimes to grasp that knowledge changes over time, especially due to environmental changes. And then access to resources, because more stakeholders involving people cost more money. So that was sort of the sentiment, that integrating knowledges for early warning systems, it needs more resources than if you run it by yourself. And then in some cases, the issue was said to be that local knowledge cannot be scaled up. And again, this is what we got from the literature, so not to death. So from challenges to enablers, there were also, of course, some suggestions. The biggest one was sort of the safeguard measures for interaction. And this really addresses the, well, trust building here is also a third. So really the relations between people, how do you do that in a way that you create a good environment to share this? And I think for research projects, or what these articles were based on, they're always a short period, whereas interaction and trust building take a long time. And I think that's an issue, what will be reoccurring. The second enabler sorry, is local adaptation and focus. So it was often suggested to make sure that you know local customs, that you focus on how things are done in the region where you work, which perhaps is not too surprising, but it was mentioned secondly. And then the fourth was focusing on the communication. How do you communicate what you do? Then a lot of the papers were, this method works. So the enabler, the positive thing was use this method, which did not help to our analysis. But it's interesting to see because that connects to how most people say it was very positive. Then again, it was about education and training provision. So thinking about giving some GIS training or giving some training probably as sort of extra to increase that communication, or that runs smoothly. Funnily enough, it was mainly for locals, not so much for the scientific knowledge holders. Then I guess the next one connects very much to the challenge of documentation, to focus on documentation of local knowledge or promote it to a younger generation to address those challenges. And here there was also, well, 17 papers that really suggested to develop knowledge separately. And this is where the discussion comes in of integration. We have 99 papers that suggest the positive outcomes, but we did have some that said there is value in developed knowledge separately. And I'll come back to that in the discussion. Another way would be to be very systematic in how you approach integration. So really have a framework, stepwise framework set up. And others really suggested to validate that local knowledge, which is a very specific approach. Again, this is from the literature, not from personal suggestions, but this is what we collected out of that. And then there were some other smaller ones. So this is what paper suggested. And what we tried to get out of it for our discussion is go a little bit deeper. And as I introduced at the start, these concepts of integration and knowledge. So I just want to take that now back, because now having gone through over these papers with numbers, what does that mean for these concepts and what we do and what we should consider? So the first one is integration. So what were the approaches that we see? I mean, I just showed you quite a boring table with approaches that they use, but what does that mean for how we approach it? And what we saw is that there's definitely a type of a ladder of integration. And developing these ladders is not very new, because in the participation literature from Chambers, for example, it's quite common to have ladders of participation, ladders of citizen science. And so even here we see ladders of integration, but because there were very few articles that are very concrete about how they integrate, what steps they took to do that, it's quite hard to set up this ladder. So there were some concrete examples. So if you're interested to see very concrete examples, I have some papers there that did provide very good information on how they did it. But we can see that the participatory methods are a little bit higher on that level of integration, whereas knowledge validation, that's not about combining, it's about putting one thing into another thing. Let's see. Then something else we noticed, that the starting point where people thought of for integration was quite different. So we had some that focused first on the people. So what science reaches local environments, or what triangulation happens, what are the community processes, what is done with this information. So approaching knowledge more as a social construct, not only as a early warning system being a technology. The other point is starting more from the technology. So from the forecast model you have, or from the GIS mapping that you need, how to include other knowledges into this predefined scientific knowledge process. So these are quite two distinct ways of approaching. And the second starting point is more from the basis of that technology, and more often the focus of these studies. So we have type of a ladder of integration, but we also have a different way as a starting point. And then one other thing on this concept of integration is the timing of integration. So integration can happen on one moment in time, but it can also be ongoing over time. And this is something where I got stuck for quite a while and had to discuss with people what to do with this. Looking at the literature, so the papers we reviewed, we saw some, as I said, I think 17 papers I mentioned in the table, so even suggested as an enabler to separate this knowledge and sort of then in the end come together to see where synergies are or where to combine it. Some advantages of doing it that way are to safeguard relations, safeguard these processes, and safeguard the methods that people use, and not take knowledge out of context while it's being developed. Whereas if you go to the other side, and there are some concrete examples of that as well, some suggested to have this ongoing dialogue going. So have different moments in time where you keep connecting about how your knowledge is developed for this early warning system. And this can also be positive for addressing some of the challenges that were mentioned. For example, by finding this common ground, building these trust relations, or reaching a understanding and deal with these dynamics that as environment changes, how knowledge is formed might change. And I think there was one on the left side, by keeping separately developed, one paper had a very nice example of rain predictions, where they decided to keep it separated, because in that context it worked better, because the people they work with are very suspicious by outsiders taking their knowledge and how they did it, or making fun of them on how they did it. So this might be a choice to make depending on the context where you are, but these were quite two opposites without being able to provide an answer here. But it's interesting to think about that even integration is not just something that happens at a moment. There are choices to be made there when you do that and in what way. Now, the second thing we looked at a little bit is power, because as I showed, there are different ways of integrating knowledges. So that means that the way you integrate reflects on how power takes place. And this is where perhaps it gets a bit abstract with circles and triangles. But I think it's quite interesting to think about this, because when I'm normally in the fields, this is not where I have time for. So it was really nice to spend some time thinking about this and what that means for what you do. So when you think about integration, it could be a combination of knowledges to form a whole. So it looks something like the triangle on your left, building up on each other. An example of the literature that we reviewed was a framework that was in Mercedal, which is quite a concrete description. So it's quite interesting to read. You get really some information on how they did it, focusing first on vulnerability factors, and then separately develop knowledge and then negotiating that integration. Whereas the other side, and this happened really most often, integration actually meant the incorporation of one thing into another. Concrete example being the validation of local knowledge, so that it fits, and only using that knowledge then, because it can be validated by scientific knowledge. This is down there. I just have one article that really delves into this a bit much, because for now I'm going to leave this here. But if you're more interested in thinking about what this means in different ways for power, that article really has some interesting discussion about as well. So some questions critical here for power is about who controls that process, which in these papers, it's really hard to get out of that. You can see it a bit if it's integration in a way of putting one component into another, it's most likely that the scientific knowledge is the power who controls that process. What are the relations within the local level and also the relations between the research and the participants? And are these knowledge providers just the stakeholders or really as an entity in themselves? And is that knowledge only treated as data? These are questions to ask, but it's rarely reflected on. There was one paper that did really reflect on this, but in a concrete sense, that mainly meant in their suggestion to reflect on these things as gender and social status. But I think that reflecting on integration and how that takes place and what integration means in the work that you're doing is actually as important to see how these power relations are. And sort of in this whole abstract thinking, to bring it a little bit down, is that early warning systems, or often these innovations, are seen as something technological, a technology development, but it really needs this social construct of knowledge as well to see how do we put what we have, the knowledge we have, in their best position. So this is the last bit, as I said, successful. 95% reported positive outcomes. Part of this is a little bit due to the romanticization of local knowledge. Also, again, some references. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I don't mean it's made more than it is, but it's actually creating a type of pressure on local knowledge. And it's not helpful, because what's most helpful is to think about what knowledges both of them can do or not do. So local knowledge might have an advantage for the context, but it would not be fair to say that can solve all our problems when these problems are caused by bigger issues such as environmental degradation or climate change. So you see that we can find time and space synergies, but we also really need to be careful there. And as suggested, there are papers that suggested keep it important. It's not always appropriate to integrate constantly. And at the end of this, it's basically thinking that integration or co-production is also not newly invented, but it's actually always a stake in place. And this is again where I came in at the start, that if you think about it yourself, you might also combine knowledges. And this is where more work on triangulation and how information is used is quite important before getting stuck on the distinctions. Because there's one big assumption underlying all this research and this use of the word of integration, which is that knowledge is binary, so local versus scientific knowledge. It would suggest that there is a distinction. And there are differences, don't get me wrong, but it's probably not always the one or the other. There are some risks with assuming that these are very distinct and people might actually use them both at the same time. For example, searching for a distinction might risk marginalizing one of them, and uphold the notion that research activities can be separated from the knowledge holders. So I sometimes also use something that I know from something. And for me personally, as a reflection, I find it sometimes quite difficult to distinguish that, because certain research questions you choose might be because you have a certain background or you have a certain knowledge, or you grew up in a certain environment. And integration in some sense then becomes the goal, instead of thinking that it actually was intended to be an instrument or helpful to designing these different early warning systems and make them practical and useful for what they're intended to do. And by keeping them, and by this extinction between knowledges, we also risk dismissing the dynamics that these both knowledges have. They're constantly changing, both of them. So they're connecting within people, but they're also changing, which makes it a very complicated system. And that's, I guess, also why I chose this background of we have these different shades of color, all connected. So in reality, knowledges are quite hybrid in what they do. So now for the last bit, because this was a literature review and it was quite abstract. So I have some things that are next, also for us, what we're doing next in the field, now taking this to the field and what that means for what we look at. Coming back though to the title, it's a requisite. Well, we definitely need the use and acknowledgement and respect of both these knowledges, but we need to be very careful in forcing this integration and take a step back and thinking what it means. And this realization that it's actually hybrid. It doesn't have to be binary. It might be more of a range. Romanticist, well, there's a tendency for romanticism, which is not helpful. And realistic, it's definitely realistic in an extent that in reality, most people are doing this already. But we really need to pay attention to the power attached to what integration means. So for me personally, what I took out this is, and what I'm taking to the next project I'm working on, is what are these implications? If we see knowledge as plural and hybrid, then for me the tendency is to maybe I need to kick out the word of integration, move to learning across. How do I deal with that, breaking that assumption? What does that mean for the work I do? And how do I deal with this idea that knowledge is dynamic? I mean, these are questions for myself, and if anyone has practical experiences with this, I really love to hear about that. And also this divide I saw a bit like between keeping knowledge development separate or really keep connecting them. What is the best way to go about that? 2022 was a very good year for this topic. There are actually 2 other papers that are around this topic as well. So if you're really interested and want to know more, please also have a look at these. So it looks like we're only going further into this topic and in the context of disaster risk reduction and management. So this is definitely the last slide. This was a literature review where we had this chance within this bigger project to dive into these more conceptual notions. And now we are also trying to take it a bit more to practice under this project together with the Red Cross in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia. So we are actually now going back to practice. But this is still ongoing. And I think, well, Rob is also involved. Some of the field data that I see that is triangulation is mostly happening. So we did a lot of surveys and interviews, and most say that they are triangulating. And for me, the question now is to look at what does that mean for the action that people take, and where can we then best support this process? So changing that assumption. Most also reported that if the knowledge is given with a really local connection, that really increases the trust in it. And something we ran into this project already is that, as I showed, we use early warning systems, which have quite a linear flow. We're going from warning to communication to action. But in reality, we see that this flow is not linear. So knowledge, especially local knowledge, is both warning and action. So how do we deal when we set up something so linear, where in reality it's going in and out a little bit? And then where can early warning system information best come in? So these are the references I used. And yeah, if there are any questions, please let me know. But I'm also really interested to hear from people themselves what their experience is with this in the field, especially with this, and what if it means to change these assumptions.
Thanks, Thirze. That was a very nice presentation, very informative. I want to open it up. If anyone has a question, please just raise a hand or unmute. Any questions from the audience?
I have a question. Sorry, I'm from my phone. I can't, if it's okay.
This is okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. This was amazing. I really liked it. And you know, I have a philosophy background, so I really appreciated the more abstract philosophical framing of it. I actually had a bit of a practical question about what you found in when people were defining success. So was it always that like the success was based on the aims that were set out at the beginning of this sort of integration exercise or activity, or were the successes sort of like, were there any sort of surprise successes? So like, where the sort of, yeah, I think that's the kind of question. So were the successes like sort of in line with the expectations, or were the successes something that sort of was novel from the integration approaches?
This is a very good question, Marina. I was definitely expecting you to come up with good questions there. I think, and it shows that most articles suggested positive. I think that means that the successes were mainly how they set out their objectives, because their objectives would be integration to reduce risk, to improve information sharing. And so they would always report that as that worked. So that would be in line with the expectation. It's quite funny in that sense, because the challenges are more the surprising thing that comes out than that the positive outcomes are. And I think that is very much reflected in that most papers always report the positive outcomes. I mean, I understand, because, you know, easier to publish and all that stuff, but yeah, I would say it's very much in line with expectations that were set out.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry, just a quick point on the question of knowledge and defining knowledge. You know, we can have a chat about this if you want. But because, like, you know, in the philosophical literature, there is a huge debate about whether you can demarcate science, whether you can sort of draw a circle around what we call scientific knowledge, right? And what is interesting is that, like, right now, basically this kind of debate has, like, just fallen in as obsolete, because it's really, people have said it's, like, really not something that you can really do. So I really appreciated, like, the fact that sort of you were talking about the sort of social constructs of knowledge, right? That the sort of social epistemological ways in which we justify what is knowledge is perhaps a more useful way of going about it. And yeah, so if you want to talk about this more in the future, you know where to find.
Especially how to pull that into practice. So definitely.
Thanks for that question, Marina. I see a hand raised by Jamie or Jaime.
Hi, hello, Jaime Abad from the JRC of the European Commission. So thank you for this wonderful presentation. This is a topic that I'm very interested also from experience in the past with, trying to integrate local knowledge on geoinformation to handle the hazards. So my question is about if you could tell us some more about the geographic scale that was used to define the word local in some of these papers, because if you're looking at this is something that has troubled me for some time when trying to work, like, what is the range at which we can talk about local knowledge. So if you was it something that you looked at when you did your paper analysis, and can you tell us something more about it?
That's a very good point. So for the map you saw, we did that on a country basis. Purely for map analysis and making it visual. Most cases, if I remember correctly, do take certain events, so in a certain region. So that indeed would not be country level, but on a very regional level, because they connected to a certain event that has happened. There were some, though, that if you talk about education or the institutional, which were very few in papers, that would be on a higher level. I hope that answers your question. It's a very good one. We did not pay that much attention to it, I'll admit.
Thanks, Jaime.
Yeah, thank you. I mean,
Sorry.
regional was more or less the answer I was expecting, but I would be interested to know if because a lot of the examples that I've seen are like at the city scale or like a very small scale of just a town. And I would be very interested to know in, like, what is the effect of this change in geographical scale, particularly because different hazards are going to have potentially different scales. And it's interesting to see how this interacts. So thank you.
Thanks, Jaime. I think next up we have a question by Estelle.
Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Estelle de Koning, and I'm the head of the World Weather Research Program at the WMO. And I was really interested in your presentation on traditional knowledge, because it's getting a lot of attention. As you say, it's nothing new. We're in the process of finalizing a 10-year project that was looking at research in polar regions. And this project group, the Polar Prediction Project, had a separate group underneath them, a subgroup called Socioeconomic Research Applications. And they worked with the traditional knowledge of the people in the North Pole, so the Arctic. And a lot of interesting information came from that on what those people perceive, be it people that are doing fishing or something else, maybe even a little bit of tourism if you want, and what scientists are doing. So it's a kind of a mix between the science and the social science, or the traditional knowledge if you want. And the question of when and how much we integrate this, of course, it can be debated, but I do think it is a kind of a co-design that has to happen, you know, in different ways and different steps maybe, but it's a communication that has to happen in some way and shape or format. And for our future project, we also really want to focus on this idea of traditional knowledge or local knowledge. Then in our case, linking to the previous comment by, was it Jamie? This was like a polar region area. So it was not a city or a very local area. And there's amazing things that came from that. And if you want more information, I can put you into contact with somebody on this topic. But this is something that we would like to explore more of also in our future research in polar regions. But I think it's a very interesting topic. And I do think one should perhaps not see it as either or something versus something else, but of course, little bits of both interacting with one another. And in terms of what we kind of like, more a cycle approach than a line approach. So it's not going from here to here, but it's a cycle of getting information, getting feedback and trying again and improving your project. So it's a cycle more than a chain. And I think that can, you know, it's not a linear, easy black and white from here to there kind of thing. But I think it's really interesting and I like the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Estelle. The project you mentioned sounds really interesting. I'm quite interested to know, actually, in the project that you guys did you keep it quite separately in perspectives, or did you have these constant dialogues where you kept integrating? What kind of approach?
It was integrated, yes. So it was bringing the science to the people and then taking the people's needs to the science through the course.
At different moments in time as you were going on. Yeah, interesting.
Very nice. Are there any other questions? I think we have time for one final question. And if
I can do a final one if there's still time.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, thanks, Thirze. It was very, very interesting. I was a bit late, so I may have missed this, but I was wondering, so assuming that knowledge is not binary, which I think we can assume, and I was very happy that you were challenging this binary view on knowledge. Do you have any ideas on how to otherwise structure knowledges? And does it make sense to structure it on based on the method it is obtained? Does that make sense, or is that also silly, just like a binary thinking? What do you think?
This is a very good question. This is actually something we now in the new project, as I said, on the ground, what we're doing with the Red Cross now, are really thinking about how to approach it then. And this is honestly, this is something I'm struggling with. It's easy to say something is complex and dynamic, but what does that mean for what you do? My personal choice in it now is to focus very much on what people use. So I think methods is a very interesting one as well, Ruben. I'm definitely going to think about that as well. For me now, I decided to let's see what people use. So give people options in that. So instead of going sort of at the front from my side, saying, I have this and this, here you go, to flip it around and see, okay, what do you use? And is there certain action taken with that? And what do you still need? So that's the way that I'm trying to figure out now. Does that help us with dealing with breaking this assumption or this thing? But I think the methods one is also an interesting one.
Yeah, or maybe a combination, but it's interesting. Oh. Thanks.
All right, I think with that, there's one final round of applause because I think you gave a very, very interesting presentation. So thank you for your time and everything today. I just put a link in the chat. Probably by tomorrow, this talk will be up on our YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with others, you can share it. And next month we have Andrew Tupper, who will be talking about the fact that it's not all weather. So please check our talk out and you can register using the link that I posted in the chat. And please note that next month will be at 9 a.m. because Andrew is based out of Melbourne. Thanks everyone for being here today. And a very big thank you to you, Thirze. Thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone.